This event takes place under the umbrella of Finance in Common and the Coalition for Social Investment, launched and led by CEB, an initiative to increase the quality and the volume of social investment globally. As you all are aware of, our conversation takes place in a very challenging and deteriorating global context. It is now well known and well established that the impacts of climate change are disproportionately affecting women, as well as marginalized, poor, and vulnerable communities. They are aggravating inequalities within and between countries. Public and private actors alike need to do better and to do more for the most vulnerable, affected by multifaceted crises. At the same time, no one should be allowed to decelerate the transition to low-carbon economies, as the cost for inaction and the temptation to slow down are increasingly growing. Public development banks, PDBs, are well placed to help building a comprehensive global agenda, integrating namely social justice, to support strong and just transitions towards a low-carbon and climate-resilient economy. They are also on front line to mitigate the impacts of global challenges and instability threats, to respond to crises, and to ensure that people are not left behind. Let me, in this regard, give a very warm welcome to the South American partners of Finance in Common, from the Latin American Association of Development Financing Institutions, who are with us today in this room. Today's event brings together key financial actors from different fields and social partners for an interactive conversation around the Director General of the ILO about the role that public development banks can play to strengthen social justice and deliver just transitions. Allow me now to give the floor, at least virtually, to the pre-recorded message of strong support to this initiative delivered by Olivier Dussopt, Minister of Labour, Full Employment and Inclusion of France.
Monsieur le Directeur général de l'Organisation internationale du travail, Monsieur le Gouverneur de la Banque de développement du Conseil de l'Europe, Mesdames et Messieurs les ministres, Mesdames et Messieurs les représentants des banques de développement, Madame la déléguée du gouvernement français auprès de l'Organisation internationale du travail, Monsieur le Directeur général de l'Agence française de développement, Mesdames et Messieurs les représentants des travailleurs et des employeurs, Mesdames et Messieurs et chers amis. J'ai tenu à vous adresser ce message vidéo pour vous dire à quel point la France est heureuse d'accueillir aujourd'hui à Paris un événement d'une telle ampleur. Je remercie pour son organisation la Coalition pour les investissements sociaux au sein du sommet Finance en commun, car cet événement n'aurait pas été possible sans le soutien indéfectible de la Banque de développement du Conseil de l'Europe et celui de l'Agence française de développement. Cet événement repose sur une conviction forte. Les aspects sociaux et environnementaux des grandes transitions sont intrinsèquement liés. Les gouvernements ne peuvent plus les envisager séparément s'ils veulent conduire des transitions qui sont à la fois écologiquement et socialement responsables. La justice sociale est en réalité partie intégrante de transitions réussies, et cela est vrai pour toutes les sociétés du globe. Dans les pays les plus exposés aux conséquences du changement climatique, les plus vulnérables sont souvent aussi les premiers impactés. Les grandes transitions ne pourront être réussies que si leurs retombées environnementales, sociales, économiques, voire sécuritaires, sont appréhendées ensemble. Pour ce faire, une très forte attention doit être portée par les gouvernements aux enjeux de formation et d'emploi décent au sein de chacun des secteurs économiques. Ils doivent également être attentifs aux dispositifs de protection sociale pour accompagner les personnes les plus vulnérables face aux conséquences de ces changements. Il en va à la fois de la soutenabilité des transitions et de leur acceptabilité par les sociétés, pour progresser ensemble vers des économies solidaires et décarbonées. Notre deuxième conviction est que les banques publiques de développement sont appelées à jouer un rôle déterminant dans la conduite de ces changements. Elles sont déjà en première ligne lorsqu'il s'agit de répondre aux crises sanitaires, climatiques ou alimentaires. Mais en réalité, elles pourraient faire encore plus pour accroître les investissements sociaux dans les secteurs qui alimentent les grandes transitions, qu'elles soient climatiques, numériques ou démographiques. Il n'y a rien de plus faux que de croire que les investissements sociaux ne seraient pas rentables. Ils renforcent la cohésion des sociétés autant qu'ils dynamisent les économies, Il représente, pardonnez-moi, des centaines de millions d'emplois qui peuvent répondre à des besoins aujourd'hui non couverts dans tous les pays du monde. Ce sont, en un mot, des retours sur investissement en cascade, et ce à un triple niveau: l'émancipation des citoyens, la pérennité des entreprises et l'avenir des États. Les banques devraient d'ailleurs accroître la mobilisation des partenaires privés pour maximiser la réduction des inégalités et en même temps soutenir le climat et la biodiversité. L'un ne peut ni ne doit aller sans l'autre. Enfin, notre troisième conviction est que la France est pleinement dans son rôle lorsqu'elle soutient une coordination mondiale au service d'une transition juste. Et à ce titre, je souhaite saluer les efforts engagés par Gilbert Humbo, directeur général de l'OIT, pour rehausser notre ambition collective sur ces enjeux cruciaux. Son action est précieuse pour rassembler les États, les organisations internationales et les institutions financières autour de la table et les mettre au service de nos concitoyens. La France, à travers l'Agence française de développement et son directeur général, Rémi Rioux, soutient cet effort de mobilisation de l'écosystème de la finance durable. Et à ce titre, les sommets finances en commun sont des instances précieuses de coordination au service des transitions les plus justes. Je veux d'ailleurs rappeler à cette occasion, ce matin, qu'à l'initiative du président de la République, la France accueillera un prochain sommet pour un nouveau pacte financier mondial. La conférence se tiendra les 21 et 23 juin prochains à Paris, et elle aura pour ambition de proposer des solutions concrètes aux défis de financement de la transition énergétique. Il s'agira de tracer tous ensemble un chemin pour mettre en œuvre le financement des objectifs de développement durable et l'accord de Paris sur le climat. Nous comptons bien sûr sur l'engagement de tous les membres de l'initiative Finance en commun pour faire de ce sommet une réussite. Et du reste, je suis certain que les travaux d'aujourd'hui permettront déjà de tracer des perspectives et d'avancer collectivement vers une justice sociale mondiale. Je vous remercie et je vous souhaite à toutes et à tous d'excellents échanges.
And Deputy Director Environment of the OECD on stage here to help us set the scene. So, Mathilde, why social justice and just transitions are so crucial today? What is at stake and why is it so urgent to act? Please.
Yes, okay. So good morning. It's really a pleasure to be here today with you. It's a very important topic that we have to tackle. We are all aware that climate change is really a daunting challenge of our time. And we have seen this week, at the beginning of the week, the launch of the FiCS assessment report of the IPCC. And this clearly shows us that the pace and the scale of action today to tackle climate change is quite insufficient. And to quote the report, we are walking when we should be sprinting. So there is a somehow rapidly closing window of opportunity to secure a livable and sustainable future. This means that change is still possible, but we need to act quickly, to act today, and to act very forcefully. And so reaching our global net zero objectives call for transformations across systems, across sectors, across institutions, but also in the way we are thinking about it. And in today's work, this cannot be done without a very strong focus on resilience. And this focus on resilience is essential in two ways. First, we must ensure that we are taking efforts to safeguard the resilience of the transition itself. That means that ensuring we stay the course in the face of global disruptions and crises, and God knows we have some of them, many of them, and it won't change. And second, we must look to strengthen our resilience and our capacity to adapt to the current and the future impacts of climate change on people and communities. And in each instance, this focus on resilience is not possible without a very deep integration and true integration of the just transition priorities. To start with, we'll not be able to transition without a very clear, a very strong and widespread, public support to the transition, and to ensure that the net zero commitments that we are making today can be realized in the future, in the world of tomorrow, with upcoming crises that we still didn't know how they will be. Now, this is really a prerequisite, this public support. And for this to happen, we need to have a true understanding of and a real action on the distributional impacts of the net zero transitions. Direct and indirect distributional impacts will be felt by workers, by the communities, and the countries as we move away from fossil fuels to alternative, more climate-friendly alternatives to fossil fuels. And this includes impacts on income, impacts on wealth, impacts on employment, impacts on housing, impacts on security. So maintaining a strong focus on tracking and addressing these distributional effects of climate policy is really essential. And secondly, and this goes without saying, and it was mentioned by the minister, the impacts of climate change itself have very significant social implications, and they are disproportionately affecting the different communities. You know, they are affecting more the marginalized people, the vulnerable people, and there are, it was said, also aggravating inequalities within countries, but also between countries. So it's well known, it's well documented. We have strong evidence that disadvantaged social groups are more exposed to environmental problems. If we just think about air pollution, the people living close to the periphery, for example, are more affected than people living in the 16s here. And also they are often more vulnerable to their impacts because they have challenge accessing finance or being able to invest in adaptation technologies, for example. So in a nutshell, and it was said, the transition will be just or it will not happen. It will not be possible to stay the course on transition. And to make it just, a lot needs to be done, beginning by shaping a new social contract to ensure widespread support and ensuring that we have a globally also coordinated approach. So it's very important that we have this group of development institutions here to discuss this topic. And how we can make this happen in practice, because I mean, saying it is easy, but then doing it, it's another story, you know, to make sure that we have a really integrated approach and not like afterthoughts thinking, oh, what could we do about the social aspects? So we need to think them really together from the beginning. We have identified at the OECD for the time being at least 5 key elements to make an effective just transition happen. The first one is, I go back to this idea of having a consensus. It's really critical to strengthen institutional mechanisms to foster consensus on the policy choices that are necessary to advance on the green transition. And you need to develop a long-term vision with the local communities, because if you have strong local stakeholder engagement in the transition planning process itself, this leads to a more coherent and a more comprehensive approach, and of course, to more politically resilient strategies. So, and in fact, it's an opportunity. It's a strong constraint, but it's an opportunity, because this green transition agenda could help us to build up a new sustainable social contract. And for example, the objective of the NDCs, the nationally determined contribution, they must be turned into concrete, very visible actions implemented and financed in the context of long-term strategies that have been really built up in an inclusive manner. So this aspect is very important, and in fact, it's an opportunity. The second aspect is of course, about the social protection system. It's necessary to design a better targeted one, and that support workers that are negatively affected by the transition policies that will be adopted. Third point, and it's also a critical point, it's the issue of skills. We need to understand what are the skills that are needed for the low carbon transition, and we need to develop them. That means the program should be, training programs should be adjusted to ensure that the right skills are in place for the net zero economy. And this implies very often having very well working links between the training institutions and the firms themselves. Fourth point, it's about, of course, the labor market. We need active labor market policies to be in place to connect people to new green jobs. And fifth point is the more like general structural policies to make sure that we can facilitate the reallocation of productive inputs across sectors. One example of that is, for example, facilitating startups so that you could have a lively startup, a green startups ecosystem. So with all that, it's clear that we have an urgency, and it's very complex to deliver a just transition to net zero. It requires a all hands on deck approach. And a critical actor for this transition is definitely the development banks. So that's why I think it's a very timely and topical discussion that we will have today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mathilde. Very challenging what you're saying. Maybe what I will just take away from what you said, it is a daunting challenge. You said that we must act quickly and forcefully. But you also said that we must adapt. Should we change or adapt? And on the other hand, I was just both. I was wondering how we can also, in a way, reconciliate long-term vision with what you said at the end about concrete and visible actions. This is a huge challenge to reconciliate, I think, these two issues. And for this reason, I give the floor to the Director General of the ILO. From the ILO's perspective, what are the current trends and challenges shaping the state of social justice today, Director General? We heard that just transition is a precondition for the OECD. And we also heard the OECD calling for a new social contract, which has been part of your program when you delivered your messages to the last governing body of the ILO. Please, Director General, tell us what is the nexus for you on these issues.
Thank you so much, Madame Carva, and good morning. Bonjour à vous toutes et à vous tous. First of all, let me express my deep appreciation not only to the Ministry of Labour in France and AFD, but also to Governor Monticelli for really hosting this critical session. And I really was hoping to be there with you this morning, but yesterday I was really taken by domestic critical importance that I couldn't be there physically. So I really want to express my regret for that, particularly when we talk about such an important subject matter, which is the new social contract and hence the social the betterment of the social justice. From where we sit, quite frankly, if we take a step back and you look at recent years, we have to recognize that the world has been going through very good technological advancement, scientific research. During COVID time, we have noticed what the science could do in a record time to have a vaccine available for citizens on that, which is very great. We know that the future of work is really leading to more and more use of platform economies, use of artificial intelligences, which will undoubtedly create a better skill set and skill requirement, but also create an increase productivity and so forth. So although currently the whole state of the economy, the global economy is not necessarily the best, we can see that when we look at that from a medium long-term perspective, we are not doing that bad from the economic standpoint. But the key point, at the same time that we have all those positive news, I'm sorry to recognize and to acknowledge that, you know, when all of us living in certain part of the world were vaccinated at 70%, in other part of the world, the vaccination rate was barely 5%. When the artificial intelligence is allowing us to have productivity gains, but the fruit of that productivity gain is not necessarily equitably shared between all the stakeholders, from the shareholders to the laborer to the workers. And today is very sad to say it, but today 52% of the global world income still within the 10% richest people of the world. And if you take the 50% of the population, the lowest 50%, those are the poorest 50%, they barely have access at 7% of the world income. So very clearly, something is wrong, and it's been increasing. I think our colleague, the colleague from that OECD, I think that was an introductory remark, made also a reference, for example, for people living around the periphery. So what we are noticing is that, particularly since COVID, the informal sector has been increasing, although we have been doing a good progress 15 years before COVID. Then the COVID has wiped away the effort to formalizing that informal sector. So when you put all of that together, it's very critical that, you know, we need a new social contract. That's where the need for a new social contract, for me, is very, very clear. And together, of course, this is a huge undertaking, and it's going to be a medium, long-term thing. But together, one of the key things, and again, I want to quickly refer to the SDGs. We all know the SDG with the 169 targets. A lot of it are a social nature. Let's be frank. A lot of it are a social nature if you can push toward achieving the SDGs. But we know today that we are all behind in all 17 schedules. Yet, each of us has been really doing the best we can. My point is that if all of us that are working on different social dimension, different parameters that help improving the social side or the social justice, we need to work much more together so that to ensure that the coherence of our action can lead to a better result. This is why I believe it's crucial for us to have some kind of a coalition around specific subject matters, which includes the very passionate case that OECD just made on the just transition, and I hope we will have a chance to come back on that. If you look at the equality in terms of gender and gender pay, have 19% gap. Gender pay gap for equal work. And globally, and in some countries, it can even go up to 23-25% pay gap. You look at clearly the just transition. Not only we know that we have a risk of leaving people behind, particularly people that heavily are currently dependent on carbonized economy. We know that you cannot flip all of a sudden to renewable energy, for example. So without training, without upskilling or reskilling those workers, and that currently depend on the carbonized economy. If you take the other side of the artificial intelligence that I referred to, you know, we know that we are going that direction, but sometimes we take it for granted that all of us, or the majority of us, have access to internet, have access to connectivity. So we are creating another world that doesn't even have access to connectivity. So again, we're going to create very likely another divide in terms of connectivity access, and therefore contributed to this injustice, this inequality gap that we. So those are kind of the where I see the thing. One last point, so not take too much of time that I haven't touched on, is the demographic shift that we are also experiencing, that is also coming and will be coming for a lot of challenges in terms of contribution to social justice. On one hand, when we talk about the demographic shift with its consequence in the care economy, we know that in the long-term pension is really causing concern in some countries, whereas in other countries, the youth or the excessive, I wouldn't say excessive, but the fact that a major part of the population is under 30 or 35 years old cause its own challenge of the risk of being left behind. And all that dimension for us is really what is causing a lot of concern. This is why we are calling in ILO for a social justice coalition so that together we can move this agenda forward. Back to you, Madam Carvalho.
Very interesting, Director General. You just brought to us two other trends that are going together with green transition, which are the digital transformations and also the demographic shift. You also talked about the fact that putting all together the challenges brings us the idea of a new social contract in which we could push forwards different social dimensions together with this social justice coalition you are advocating for. And also the fact that, for example, we have an issue of access to resources. This is what you said about connectivity, but also the fact that what also Mathilde Ménard said about disproportionate distribution of these changes when you talked about demographic shift that does not affect in the same manner different continents on the planet. So with that said, I want to give the floor to Governor Monticelli. The CEB is a leading multilateral development bank, as you are an outstanding high-level responsible. You have been in different multilateral fora before. And with this social mandate, how do you approach the social climate nexus and just transitions through the lens of social investment? You.
Thank you. First, let me extend a very warm welcome to everybody here in the room and also connected. I am really very pleased and honored to host this important event, and the reason is that this challenge, the nexus, is very close to our mission, because we are a special multilateral development bank, because we are the only bank that has as the sole mission the one of financing social investment. And clearly, we believe that we can play an important role in addressing this challenge, which is a global challenge. We have as a mandate to operate only in Europe, in our member states, but we perfectly understand that this challenge is global, that our contribution can be global, and this is why we are so pleased to be an active partner of the Finance in Common initiative. And another important contribution that we try to give from a global point of view is to publish technical briefs that provide some lessons from our direct experience that we think have a global relevance. But now let me focus on what we believe that multilateral development banks can do to address the challenge. And of course, the first starting point must be what was already very clearly highlighted in the address by the minister, namely that the climate change is has a social impact, and it has a very direct social impact. When we have heat waves that are caused by the climate change, well, they are going to affect disproportionately the most vulnerable. Just to make an example, and this is where the multilateral development banks can play a role, making sure that their investments, the investment they finance, take at the same time both dimensions into account. And this is an effort that must be part and parcel of the important issue of consistency of the various actions that the Director General of ILO was pointing at. And this consistency, considering the joint nature of the challenge, might sound a kind of abstract concept, but it is not at all. Because what we need to do are social investments, social projects that are low in carbon emissions, and at the same time put forward adaptation measures that are particularly caring of the most vulnerable that would be affected. And this joint action is ultimately going to deliver results that make a transition that is just. And let me illustrate this with a few examples taken from our projects. Let's think about investment that we finance to address energy poverty. And this we did together with the Dutch National Heating Fund. And there, of course, we made sure that in alleviating the energy poverty issue, more environment-friendly health heating generation technique were used. Just an inclusive transition means once again that these investments that we make, for example, in education, are climate friendly. Let me quote examples of investment that we made in Georgia, where we supported a major school renovation program, where we had the fittings that were having a major improvement in the quantity of emissions. Now, let me turn on with example on the other side of the joint action that a project can do to address the social climate nexus. Mitigations investment. We have been financing flood protection measures in Poland for many years, and now in Greece, and these were in areas where the investment prevented floods that would affect the most vulnerable in a more severe way. Let me make the example of the protection against wildfires in Turkey. And once again, it would be the poor farmers who would be affected most. Just to conclude, multilateral development banks should really address this nexus in a very mindful way through implementation, the definition and implementation of the project that takes this into account at the very inception of the conception of the project.
Thank you very much, Governor Monticelli. It is very interesting to hear from you about very concrete projects. And I just take away the last sentence you proposed, which was, from the inception, we must have in mind these joint idea of just transition and social justice going together. With that said, I want to turn to Marie-Hélène Loison. How can public development banks, so you as Deputy CEO of AFD, how can they prepare the conditions for successful transitions, reconciling economic prosperity and also environmental sustainability? You for 7 minutes. Thank you.
Can you hear? Yes. So at AFD, we're convinced, of course, of the urgency to scale up social investments. And as Mathilde and Governor Monticelli stressed, as an integrated component and not as an afterthought or as an add-on. So where and why do we need more social investments? Let me develop 3 things. First, to resist, to be more resilient in the face of the various crises we're facing. Secondly, because the transitions will require new skills. And third, because transition will also displace many workers. To just let me develop on these 3 items. So first, resilience to crisis. Well, we have seen, of course, during the COVID crisis that we needed stronger social protection systems. But also what we see is that we need also more adaptive social protection systems, because it is clear that the people, the households that needed to be protected during the COVID crisis, for example, are not the same that need to be protected, for example, from the effects and impacts of inflation and higher energy prices. So we need to have more adaptive social protection systems. And just to give you an example, this is what we are supporting in the Sahel, for example, to mitigate the impact of climate change on rural farmers, for example. Secondly, because the ecological transitions, of course, will create many jobs. We know that billions are needed to build a new infrastructure. And so this is an opportunity because it will create, it has the potential to create many jobs. But of course, to make sure this is happening, the countries need to have the adequate human resources. And here I'm not only talking about engineers and researchers, but also about workers and technicians to install solar panels, for example. So the countries need to make sure that their education and training systems are accessible to the poorest households, which is not currently the case. And I think that's true for every country. And this point is particularly important for women who are often excluded from the most lucrative jobs. And finally, the third item I was mentioning is, of course, the transition will create many jobs, but it will also displace many workers. You know, all those working in coal sector, the car industry will be changing fast. And so we need to work on 2 things here. The first one is to reskill these workers, make sure they can move to other sectors, and also in the meantime to have income support measures so that that does not create, you know, higher unemployment and poverty. So this is obviously a key condition for successful transitions. Another key element for successful transitions is what Mathilde mentioned in her speech, and that is consensus. So what does it mean for public development banks? It means that this is not only a technical issue, you know, that requires expertise and good engineers. It is a very political issue. And saying that means that process matters. The way strategies are built, the way projects are built are, of course, a very political matter. And so that means that we have to integrate civil society participation, both in building our own strategies, but also in making sure that dialogue is happening, as you said, at inception, when not only the projects are conceived, but also the public policy are conceived, and when we're talking about important reforms. So IFD supports this dialogue with different tools, with modeling tools, by mobilizing expertise, but also by supporting governments very early in the reform of their social protection and education systems, precisely to mitigate the impact and maximize returns. So just let me mention 3 actions in this regard. First, we have developed a modeling tool that is named GEM. And through this model that we have actually provided to governments, including actually as an open source. But through this model, we can see the impact of global warming and also the impact of increased scarcity of natural resources with the dynamics of capital debt and underemployment. The model also take into consideration the way in which the reduction of inequalities facilitate the resilience of national or regional economy. And so that is helping governments to make the right decision and appropriate choices, and also to explain why this is proposed. Secondly, we support this dialogue by working with various civil society organizations, and precisely also because these organizations work with women, migrants, and children. For example, we work with ActionAid, Oxfam, and CARE. And just to give you one specific example, we are currently supporting Secours Catholique Caritas France, and they implement a large program of capacity building of partners and communities in 17 countries on 4 continents in order to promote a common vision of what is a just ecological transition. And I think this is a key action that public banks can undertake. And finally, just a few words also about a key element of the action of public development banks, and that is aligning strategies and activities with Paris Agreement and SDGs. We have worked as soon as 2016 on aligning activities and strategies with the Paris Agreement. So we ensure that every project and every financing is supporting actually partners in their low carbon and resilient trajectories. For example, we have put in place a 2050 facility, which amounts to 30 million euro. And this facility is supporting 15 countries in delivering their long-term strategies. For example, we have done that with Vanuatu, Ethiopia, Burkina Faso, and they have published, their strategies at the COP27. We also ensure in the implementation of France's commitment to the Just Energy Transition Partnerships. And for example, we have signed at COP27 the first public policy loan to South Africa. It's a 300 million euro loan to South Africa. And we make sure in the deployment of this financing that the just component of this partnership is taken into account. And we are also part of discussions for future just energy transition partnerships, for example, with Vietnam, Senegal, or Indonesia, where the ILO also has a long-standing policy dialogue on social protection and labor.
I just want to underline what you said about the process and the fact that civil society participation is key in the success of the projects you are implementing. For this reason, we are very happy to have with us employers and workers representatives here. I would be very happy to hear from them about this civil society participation and capacity building. First of all, Jacqueline Mugo, you are the employers representative here, and from the African continent. To which extent do you think that the private sector recognizes and tackles the interlinkages between social and environmental aspects, and how could the private sector be encouraged to invest even more on education skills? You heard about training programs that should be adjusted health, social protection. This was what Marie-Hélène just underlined before at the end of her talk. How do you think that private sector could be instrumental in this issue? Jacqueline, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for your kind invitation extended to employers to participate in this important conversation. On your question regarding the extent to which the private sector recognizes and handles the interlinkages between social and environmental aspects, let me start by saying that business is dependent on society and the environment. This we are aware of as employers. So that is why we invest in policies and interventions that support the development of the societies we operate in and also care for the environment in a world that is increasingly changing and that has been impacted very significantly over the last few years. So we look at our customers, our employees, and our suppliers are part of these societies in which we operate. So employers organizations such as the Federation of Kenya Employers, which I head, have always been aware of social and environmental aspects and their linkages, and we have consistently helped members to tackle, anticipate, and adjust to them. But the world has changed significantly. I think the DG was talking about this earlier and a number of other panelists. The world that we've operated in because of the pandemic, the crisis the world is in has changed. And so as constituents and as private sector, we are grappling with this scenario. At the ILO level, we have helped to strengthen and structure engagement of all stakeholders on social health and environment issues that impact the labor markets, especially in the recent years. At national level, employers' organizations have been engaging governments to build policies with support from the ILO since its inception over the last 100 years to do this. So this continued collaboration is very important towards advancing what we are calling social justice and the objectives of the many frameworks that exist, such as the SDGs, the MNE guidelines, the UN guiding principles, amongst many others. In addition to this, we have taken part in areas like CSR, corporate social responsibility, corporate responsible business conduct, occupational health and safety, and philanthropy. So the private sector has been playing a significant role. The second aspect of your question was how we as private sector could be encouraged to invest more in these areas. Globally, again, the private sector is already contributing in many ways. We contribute to education through partnerships with universities, with the education and learning providers. We ourselves provide education. We're in the health and social protection, which is a big challenge in the developing world right now. So there are long-established systems. If you look at the taxation, the pension systems, which are increasingly being looked at by governments to finance national development, social protection, which is both a challenge and an opportunity. We've invested in training and learning institutions and also creation of jobs and investments in many different projects. But given that we are discussing climate change and the world, greening the world, I think that the reality is that the thinking needs to change and there is need for greater support for the private sector extended by the public development banks for us to help industry and academia enhance the partnerships that they've had. This will include supporting the adoption and scaling up of identified good practices where they're working in both industry and academia to promote social and environmental development. The area of adoption of modern social and climate sensitive technology and industrial machines and equipment should also be part of the support that the PDBs extend to the private sector to be able to enhance its participation. And always at the bottom of this is the skills development agenda, which has been happening, but there are new challenges, especially for developing economies. How do we develop the skills for greening the economy? How do we address the development of skills for addressing climate change as a whole, which is a new area for us? So I think this is the one area that requires financial flows which need to be optimized and made more accessible. Developing and emerging economies need support to reach a stronger adaptation finance goal and for mitigation. I think the reality is that the private sector, particularly in the developing world, is largely informal and also has a fairly big, significant element of SME. So issues of access to finance and affordability of finance are crucial elements that need to be further strengthened and implemented. Many countries suffer from unfavorable credit conditions and are debt-ridden, and also have unfavorable credit conditions. And they have less investment. They don't have available capital, and therefore they lack capacity to further invest in social health and education policies. So to some extent, the private sector is under some distress because we haven't really recovered from the rigors of COVID-19. The economies globally, but particularly in the developing world, are facing very, very many challenges. And there are indications from a survey that the ILO conducted that more than 60% of the world's employed population are in the informal economy. When we talk about the private sector, we talk about the formal economy, but it's fairly small in a large part of the world. According to this new ILO report, it shows that 2 billion people work informally, most of them in emerging and developing countries. So financing and innovative solutions for formalizing and greening these workers and enterprises needs to be pursued more vigorously. We talked about demographics earlier. By 2020, Africa will be the home of more than 2 billion people. And 2 in every 5 of the world's children will be born here in Africa. So meeting their needs with sustainable sources of modern energy for consumption and production will be essential to social welfare and economic development. So my point is that the private sector is doing a lot, but given the current challenges that the world is in and the realities of informality and the fact that matters climate change, greening the economy, decarbonization, these are new elements that we need to create the skills, the awareness and the capacity for Africa to participate and the rest of the developing world so that we don't end up alienating an even larger segment of the world's population at a time when we're talking about social justice. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jacqueline. I hope that public development banks present here heard from your call for partnership with businesses, and you are a key player in this community, but also to enlarge the discussion with civil society organizations to social partners, if possible. And also, I will just take away the burden you underlined of informal jobs and also of the demographic pressure in the African continent to take into account when we are dealing with green transition and social justice. With that said, Owen Tudor, you are the workers' representative here. In this complex context, what are the risks the workers face and which are the opportunities they can seize? Just for 7 minutes, as if it is a huge question, but we would like a very concise answer. Thank you, Owen.
Well, thanks very much. I will try to do my best. I have to say I've got a terrible cold at the moment, so if my voice is coming over strange, I apologize. If you like my voice this way, then it's not because of the cold at all. It's my normal voice. I'm Owen Tudor. I'm the Deputy General Secretary of the International Trade Union Confederation, which is the largest democratic organization in the world with 200 million members across 164 countries and territories. The threats that our members and workers generally face, fairly self-evident. People have mentioned a lot of them already. The pandemic, obviously, the climate emergency, which is obviously critical to this discussion, but also the cost of living crisis, the effect of wars and conflicts, and the increasingly worrying development of the closure of democratic space. As a result of this, we've developed a call for a new social contract for recovery and resilience, several people have already talked about a new social contract. For us, that means more and better jobs. It means higher wages, including decent minimum living wages. It means strong rights at the workplace. In particular, a greener, healthier and safer workplaces, which is obviously a critical element of the discussion today. Social protection for all. And I noticed that many people have referred to social protection today. We'd like to see a global social protection fund that actually pulls together the various resources that are available and kickstarts the development of a social protection floor for people. I agreed with much of what Mathilde said at the very beginning, but I'm always slightly worried when people talk about targeted social protection. Obviously, you should only receive unemployment benefits if you're unemployed and so on. So there's obviously an element of that targeting, but we're often worried that that the benefits of universality of social protection are ignored. But back to the new social contract, we also believe equality is a key element of that, and inclusion, democratic, inclusive societies as the way to develop the social, the sustainable development goals, achieve those goals. Now, in terms of what that actually means, in terms of the opportunities that presents, we'd like to see a move towards more enforceable standards in what development banks do to make sure that they are actually delivering on issues that are crucial to working people. We want to work with those development banks as trade unions to help develop plans for greener jobs, as part of contributions to the NDCs under the Paris Climate Agreement. We want to see that just transition for working people, leaving no one behind. Investments also in things like the care economy and infrastructure, in public health and education. And in particular, if I can say this to the development banks that are here today, what we would like to see, as well as those enforceable standards, is an understanding and a support for social dialogue. That means promoting it in the countries where you operate, but also practicing it. So among some of the key demands that we're looking for here, we want to see policy mandates and procedures that operationalize the sustainable development goals with full and decent employment, as I said, at the center. We want them to contribute to decent work through investment criteria and results measurement systems that track the quality and quantity of employment. We're not just looking at growth overall. We want people to actually have more and better jobs, as I said earlier. We want binding operational safeguards and due diligence requirements aligned with international standards such as those that Gilbert produces, not on his own, I should say, but those that Gilbert produces through the International Labour Organization. And we want in particular accountable shared governance, including trade union representation on governing boards and transparent public disclosure of investments. And I think those are some of the key things that we're looking for at the moment. And as we build up to the summit later this year, it's particularly important that development banks involve trade unions as representatives of working people in the countries that they operate in, with regular consultations about proposals and the actions they take, but also with the global trade union movement and the trade union movements in the source countries of the investment, to make sure that rights are respected. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Owen. More and better jobs. This is what I just take away from what you said, and also involving trade unions in regular consultations, maybe from the inception, ladies and gentlemen, at the global and maybe also at the community level. With that said, I would like to ask our distinguished speakers for a second round. We're in 3 minutes only, sorry for that. We would like to know better understand better your efforts in terms of mobilization in the spirit of finance in common. So Carlo Monticelli, as an MBD providing financing and implementing assistance for projects, how do you support communities in making them more resilient?
Thank you. Resilience is an absolutely important concept to strengthen communities addressing the challenges that they know that they have to address, but also to addressing the shocks that they do not exactly know what it will be. Let me make the example, of course, the COVID pandemic, where there was this major shock affecting communities that communities could not predict. But nonetheless, there are investments, processes that can help building this resilience. Now, resilience is by definition a multi-sectoral concept. And so there is no silver bullet that would apply to all communities. So what is important is to develop precise, tailored solutions that address the various areas that are more relevant, exploiting synergies. Who can define these synergies? And the most relevant, local communities. And this is where the process becomes absolutely crucial. The process of consultation in devising investment priorities, consultation involving the civil society, of course, employers and workers, so that we have a participation in planning. And their multilateral development banks can act as catalyst in the planning, and then, of course, crucial partners in implementation. Let me just quote one example of the financing that SEB did of the renovation of historic villages of Vuno and Dermi in Albania, where the historic heritage was leveraged to create jobs, to attract a new business in terms of tourism, but also taking care that the new benefit would equally and fairly share, providing then help to build infrastructures.
Interesting, actually, because now you shifted our view to new areas, like you were talking about with historical heritage, and we can see how the solutions could be multifaceted if we want to enhance communities' resilience. Director General Gilbert Ngbo, as a distinguished representative of the UN family, what is, in your view, necessary to put the SDGs back on track and to reinforce the social component of sustainable development? Are you with us?
Yes, I am. Yes, I am. Thank you so much for giving me the floor again. I mean, what does it take to put the SDG back on track? This is a huge question, and I'm pretty much sure this is what is in the ongoing debate leading to the UN summit in September in New York on the review of where we stand with the SDGs. As I said earlier, we all know that we are behind schedule, unfortunately. But I think the starting point, it might seem almost kind of evident, but I think it's important to repeat it. We need some kind of a renewed political commitment by the head of state and different stakeholders. So a renewed political commitment. The second thing that will come into my mind is the policy coherence. As you have seen, all the intervention on the first round, Anushe, you realize that there is a consensus about the need to bring the social at the same level as the climate change, at the same level as the economy on that. So yet, all those multiple parameters that are set in the SDGs, we are late. So I think the policy coherence, the réseautage, all the different agencies, multilateral, bilateral, private sectors, and trade union and civil society, all of us that are working in improving the social dimension, we need to work better in terms of checking the coherence in our policy approaches. So the policy coherence for me is the second key thing. The third key thing that I will mention, which will not be surprising to you, let's face it, it remains the financing. So on that, I really, really welcome the presence, first of all, that Governor Monticelli accepted to host us, and also the presence of a lot of public development banks from financing common colleagues from Latin America and elsewhere, presence today. And you know there are some ongoing discussion about the global reshaping of the financing architecture for the financing for development. So that I really want to encourage all of us contributing to the need to reshape the financing for development. What we have seen in the past years, including during COVID, I've seen a lot of effort, be it from Bretton Woods institution or to other financing development. But then when you look at the expectation, what is needed, is the gap is so huge that we just cannot continue with business as usual. The fourth point I will mention, and Owen also touched on that, talking about strengthening the social dimension of it. You know, there are so many dimensions. If I take the social protection, for example, you know, it works recalling that half of the population, 4 billion people, half of the population has zero protection. Whatever you could consider social security or maternity leave or health insurance, nothing, zero, nada on that. So that itself for me is just mind-boggling. We can only improve the social side only if we move from the concept of a new social contract away from the concept to a plan of action. What does it take for us to change that and to kind of efficacy un peu les codes? You know, we need to shift and to break that existing code so that we can move the needle on that. So that new social contract, I'm really looking forward that it's not new anymore. We put it into reality, and what does it take? This is what I will really hope that during the SDG review in September, that come very strongly. The other dimension that I think is important to really strengthen the S as social side is really, again, this is a point that I think both the workers and employers have a consensus on, the need for scaling up our skills. You know, I'm not an expert in education, but I fundamentally of the view that the whole education system will need to reshape it. You know, from kindergarten to post-retirement education, lifelong learning, that is much more adapted to our current environment in a way that, truly speaking, we can say that every citizen has equal access to opportunities. because for me, that's really the fundamental. If you want to improve the social, if you want to improve the social justice, is to ensure that every citizen truly has equal access to opportunities, so each one can define, make decision on their life. Thank you so much.
Director General. So tailored solutions and synergies from CEB, policy coherence, financing social protection and lifelong learning from the ILO. So all this prepares us to give the floor to Marie-Hélène Loison as AFD. What is the role of global coalitions, such as International Development Finance Club or Finance in Common Summit, to help public development banks to ensure that their investments align with and contribute to the achievement of the two pillars of a new social contract, which are SDGs and the Paris Agreement. The floor is yours for 3 minutes. Thank you.
So yes, as you mentioned, we belong and support two coalitions. So the International Development Finance Club, which is a group of 26 national and regional development banks, promoting, as you said, SDGs and the Paris Agreement, and the Finance in Common initiative, which brings together more than 500 development banks, managing approximately $23 trillion in assets and providing about $2.7 trillion in annual investments. So that represents about 12% of global investment flows. So I think these figures are interesting and it shows the interest of that coalition, because what we wanted to show was precisely the potential of this group. So how can coalitions accelerate achievement of SDGs and Paris Agreement? 4 things. First of all, through knowledge sharing and capacity building on measuring and mainstreaming climate and SDG finance. For example, IDFC has developed a climate and biodiversity toolbox. Finance in Common launched an investment agenda for health and social protection, which aims to strengthen health commons from pandemic preparedness to climate readiness. So that's the first role of coalitions. Secondly, through advocacy of the role of public development banks on redirecting and aligning financial flows. As an example, IDFC is publishing every year the green finance mapping on green finance contributions from members. And for example, in 2021, the green finance provided by members was $224 billion. The club is also working on a framework to be able to report on gender finance. So that is important, obviously, to measure progress, because as we say, what is not measured cannot be managed. Also, Finance in Common is also increasingly incorporating respect of human rights in its activities together with a civil society organization. Thirdly, role of coalition is also to obviously increase cooperation between members, especially in easing access to project preparation and project financing. So we have also very concrete actions. For example, IDFC is developing a program on sustainable urban development, which will be financed by the International Climate Initiative of the German Ministry of Economic Affairs and Climate Action. And finally, also cooperation, increasing cooperation with other partners in the financial ecosystem. Another example, IDFC has a partnership with the Green Climate Fund in order to facilitate the access to its resources. And Finance in Common also foster new partnerships, such as a new alliance of African National Development Banks, or with the Global Center on Adaptation to explore blended finance strategies to increase adaptation investment.
Thank you very much. I now turn to Jacqueline Mugo. Jacqueline, how can public development banks support businesses such as SMEs to advance social justice and just transitions? And do you have any example of PPPs that have enabled sustainable enterprises to give us. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this question. I think overall, businesses need conducive environments to operate, stability in the taxation and the legislative frameworks. But specifically on how SMEs can be supported, I think that one of the key things is financing. There are indications that 26% of public development bank assets actually at global level are under mandate to support SMEs. So they're already doing a lot, but it needs to be more focused, to be scaled up and blended with other financial mechanisms. Small and mid-sized businesses will have to make significant investments and capacity development to advance their supply chains if they are to remain competitive and ensure productivity in this increasingly complex business environment. At the same time, only 30% of climate funding has gone to emerging and developing markets, though they are most exposed, as we know, to the physical consequences of climate change. So governments and international stakeholders and PDBs must boost funding and direct investments to change this scenario. From the existing research from Finance in Common, PDBs, there's the call for further political impetus and clarity in their performance frameworks is needed to engage different pools of actors and also the private sector. So if PDBs were to commit to a ratio of, say, an average of 20% climate finance, they could actually extend more than $500 billion of climate finance per year and mobilize much more private funding. So my second point is really the involvement of the private sector. The first one was the stability in the regulatory and the business environment and the need for focused, scaled up approach in the financing. I think the private sector, the inclusion of the private sector, including private banks, investment funds, pension and insurance sector funds, and PDBs, bringing all these actors together can help expand PDB impact, in addition to closer links to the government and public sector. So we need to work better together to bring this financing in a cohesive manner to the SMEs. The third area, since you've given me a very short time to answer two questions, is the need for systemic approach and a toolbox of measures that work hand in hand, adapted to specific national contexts to address the needs of the SMEs. Because I believe there is no one size fits all and there is no silver bullet. We must look at the specific needs of each country and address those. The third suggestion or idea we have is that PDBs should become innovative in supporting SMEs development, and more specifically, the transformation of informal enterprises into established businesses. What can we do to give an incentive to these informal sector players to be formalized? This kind of innovation could include supporting initiatives that improves productivity, that improves the quality of their products and the market access of the informal enterprises. Some specific examples, I'll give just two because time is tight. One is from Indonesia. The PTSMI developed and blended finance platform called SDG Indonesia 1, which was aimed at getting more international funding to help improve project quality so that there is a better quality pipeline. The new facility includes resources to review projects. They can act as a connector for both donors and the clients to reduce costs and complexity and improve impacts for both. In Mexico, NAFIN have developed, NAFIN Fondo Sostenible, NAFIN, have developed this approach where they act as the trustee to receive and administer donations from international organizations for projects in Mexico. And this approach has also been applied in Namibia, who have, for example, a specific green credit line with KfW in Germany to support projects in Namibia. So they also place bonds on local markets so they can have both domestic and international sources of financing and be able to scale up. But to make an even bigger impact, the development finance institutions, I believe, should shift away from large-scale conservative investments, which is what has been happening, which have well-focused returns, you're sure of good returns, and embrace smaller proof-of-concept investments backed by blended finance to address funding gaps for developing economies. I think a different approach is needed here so that we can increase grant funding for the smaller farms without requiring governments to give guarantees. So, for example, in Asia, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and the Global Energy Alliance for People and Planet recently entered into a $1 billion strategic investment partnership that identifies opportunities to co-finance green energy transition projects and mobilize private capital in emerging economies in the region. So these are two examples. One last one I really want to give is an example from the US, where the 2022 Inflation Reduction Act provides tax incentives for key climate technologies, including incentives to ramp up carbon capture facilities and boost green hydrogen production. So the goal is to spur investments in early stage companies that are developing and deploying the innovative technologies needed to meet net zero goals. And I think this kind of tax incentive can spur the participation of key players for us to be able to reach net zero goals. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jacqueline. It was a difficult exercise, I admit, and you just did it very successfully. Now, Owen, the floor is yours to explain to us how trade unions can collaborate with PDBs, and what could be your specific contribution to advance labor rights with them?
So I'm going to cheat slightly given the shortage of time and respond in part to some of the other things that people have said, as well as hopefully answering your question. I think Gilbert was teasing me slightly about the idea that the new social contract may not be quite so new. And the answer, I think, is that no, as an idea, it's not so new. But in terms of implementation, if we manage to get it implemented, then it would represent a new social contract between the parties in society. And secondly, I'd say in terms of the things that people have been saying about skills, I mean, as Gilbert will obviously know, and you, Anusha, this is on the agenda for the International Labour Conference this June, but perhaps needs to be a bit more broad than the way it's being discussed at the moment in terms merely of apprenticeships, although I'm a big fan of apprenticeships. I think in terms of answering your particular question, Anusha, and then I want to make one final point. Our main role as trade unionists is to give working people a voice, and also to make sure that that voice is heard and acted upon. So, the relationship we want to have with the PDBs is to discuss those concerns and needs that are raised by working people with them, and to ensure that standards are, in some cases it's developed, in other cases it's a matter of implementation, to make sure that those concerns and needs are addressed. So hence the points I was making earlier about social dialogue, about representation on boards, about the work that that development banks do in country, and also the rules that they adopt globally. Now, the final point that I wanted to make, though, was about the Finance in Common summit that this is all leading up to. And I start with the issue of financing social protection, which I think, which Gilbert mentioned, and which I think is a clear and pressing issue, and more important in the face of climate, the climate emergency. It's a big challenge working out how to finance social protection, but there seems to be a consensus, certainly among this group, that this is a key objective. What we need to do is we need to start working out how to do it in detail, how to make sure that social protection that, as Gilbert said, is needed by so many hundreds of millions of people is done, and the Financing Commons Summit, I think, needs to have an agenda of responsible and transformational in public investment, especially to meet the Sustainable Development Goals, and in particular Sustainable Development Goal 8 on decent work, including concessional finance that can be counter-cyclical, that can fill the gaps that other investment is not providing. Overall, I think the challenge that we face is to marry the financial resources we can mobilize to the social ambitions that we've all been expressing.
Thank you very much. So we heard your pledge about financing social protection, and I think our distinguished bank representatives are very conscious of the issue. But before I give the floor to the room for questions, I would like to give the floor to Mathilde Ménard. She wanted to react also to what she heard.
I took that a call for due process, and many of you also mentioned how to ensure that we have the right process to really integrate these two dimensions, environmental one and labor one or social one together. And may I quote our OECD standards, because I think they could be instrumental to help to do so properly. We have the M&E guidelines that were referred to by Madame Mugo, and we are currently revising them, and in particular to beef up very, very significantly the environmental chapter, but there is a labor chapter, there is a human rights chapter. So it's a way to help in integrating all these dimensions. And we have specific, related due diligence guidance, in particular for the financial sector and in particular for the National Development Bank. So I think this is a tool that you can use to help you, considering all these dimensions together from the inception.
Thank you very much for this extra information you gave us. Now we will give the floor for some questions, comments, or suggestions from the audience. Please raise your hand and the organizers will give you a micro. But to begin with, may I give the floor to Maria Fernanda Manrique Diaz, representing Banco Dex Colombia. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the presentation and discussions. The next Financing Common meeting to be held in Cartagena, Colombia in September will be an important forum to discuss the role of the Development Bank in a just transition. Particularly, the Latin American and Caribbean region face challenges in meeting SDGs and the 2030 agenda, especially in relation to the SDG 1, no poverty. Due to situations such as the poverty rate close to 30% in 2022, increasing formality of jobs in the post-pandemic phase, and the materialization of the climate risks such as hurricanes, floods that generate social and economic losses impacted especially women and vulnerable people. Additionally, it's important to consider the challenge like those we have evidence in Colombia associated to the energy transition in territories, where the productive vocation has been coal and gold mining. The question is, how are you going to prepare these people to integrate in new decent jobs? In this context, the Development Bank should design financial and technical assistance programs for the micro, small, and medium enterprises in the context of the just transition. The challenges, questions, and the framework of the social coalition will be discussed in FiCS 2023 in Cartagena, Colombia on September 4, 5, and 6. Along with the president of Bancolex and the other members of the organization team, we invite you to participate in this forum. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And now I give the floor to Vera Lucia Guedes Teixeira, representing BNDES Brazil. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. It's a pleasure for me to be here representing BNDES, the Brazilian Development Bank. The social, environmental, and climate agenda has been part of the BNDES activities in the last decades. In addition to being one of the main financiers of renewable energies in the world and the main supporters of the forestry agenda in the country, the bank has around 40% of its credit portfolio focused on the green economy. We believe that in addition to be supplier of investment resources, development banks can also structure projects providing patient capital and making investments feasible, like we heard today. Considering this scenario, we are structuring solutions in the Amazon region, which impacts directly on the country's climate agenda. That's the case of Garante Amazônia, being created to guarantee financing in forestry economy activities, and that will also contribute to reduce the pressure deforestation in the region. Focused on clients such as family farmers, fishermen, and indigenous, it will provide access to credit for those who make a living from the sustainable forests activities. It also provides non-refundable resources to pay for technical assistance network. Another initiative is the pilot project called Raízes, Roots in English, created with partnerships with federal and local government and private and public institutions to support integrated actions for land regularization, ecological restoration, social infrastructure, and bioeconomy in the Amazon. Raízes will provide greater economic integration in addition to forest restoration and preservation. The pilot project should serve 1,600 families in a region covering in an area of 120,000 hectares. Another important initiative is the Amazon Fund. This fund was created in 2008 to raise donations for non-refundable investments in actions to prevent, monitor, and combat deforestation, and to provide support for traditional communities as indigenous peoples. It has been frozen in the last 4 years. Even so, since created, more than 100 projects were financed. Currently, the fund has almost 6 million euros. Norway is the main donor, followed by Germany and Brazilian company Petrobras. Under the present government, 14 projects are being resumed in activities like bioeconomy, food security, protection of indigenous peoples, and the fight against deforestation. Other investments are being expected. In resume, we believe that BNDES and development banks in general can be relevant players in the implementation of public policies through the articulation and strategic alignment of public and private partners, focusing on climate and social improvements. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any of our panelists, you want to react to the two presentations first before we go back to the floor?
Thank you for this presentation, because I think forestry is actually a very good example of the necessity to reconcile environmental and economic and social objectives. Because as we know, in some countries, I was actually meeting yesterday with a delegation of Cambodian ministers. And in Cambodia, most of the emissions actually come from land use change, so deforestation, in fact. And if you want to save and protect the forests, you also have to make sure that the local communities have access to other economic opportunities. So this is what we endeavor to do at AFD when we support not deforestation project, preservation of forest is precisely to make sure that we also support creation of economic opportunities. And I think what we need to reflect on is also how can we innovate and create mechanisms through which we could create income flow to local communities in exchange for preserving preserving the forest and in fact helping to achieve global goals.
Thank you very much. Any questions from the floor or on the chat? Please present yourself before asking your question or making your remark.
Thank you. Nice to meet you. I'm Christina Tora. I work at the GSG. We became a partner to Finance in Common last year, and we have been collaborating to bring the perspective of how to work with the private sector and specifically with private investors. So really creating the connectivity, much more connections between the development finance world and the private finance world. I guess my question to you is, and I welcome what the Secretary General for ILO said, is we cannot do business as usual anymore because of the urgency to act. Just to remind ourselves of the kind of news items in the last couple of weeks, right? GIEC has again published a very warning publication about how close we are to global warming, and also a moratorium on artificial intelligence, which is putting at risk 25% of jobs in the world, right? So I think there is a real urgency to act, and yet still not enough private capital is flowing towards, the SDGs. I think the reminder also that only 30% of climate finance is going to emerging markets is a warning sign. Only 4% of global investments are going to emerging markets. Private investors are very risk averse today, and they don't want to invest, and they are pulling out of emerging markets. So there's a huge risk. We see the development finance community as a really important anchor to drive more capital towards these topics. And so I really would like to hear from you how you see that, how you will how you are thinking about the financial mechanisms that you have at your disposal today to increase the mobilization of private capital. So really, this is my question to you. We are at 0.4% of private capital mobilization ratios, and it's good, but it's not enough. So really, how can we work together more between the different parties, and especially the private investors, to address these topics?
Thank you very much. So Director General Gilbert Humbaut, the question is for you first, but also the others. I'm sure the other speakers have also something to say about that. How can we make the shift by combining private and public investments all together? And I think this could have a specific echo for you as a former president of IFAD also.
Yeah, thank you so much. Before coming to the very specific question, there was one piece that I just want to come back on to, given the point that the last speaker just made, and hoping that can generate a little bit more discussion on that. That, she was saying that maybe we should look at slowing down artificial intelligence that are threatening jobs out there. I think, in as much as I wish I could say yes to that, I think it's important for us to realize that it doesn't matter how you do it, technology advancement will just continue. We have to make sure that we are in the train, otherwise we'll be left on the train station. So ILO study has demonstrated that the artificial intelligence or technology in general will create more jobs. It's creating and will create more jobs than the total number of jobs that the same technology will put behind us, the jobs that are going to be lost. But the key is those that are losing the job, we need to bring them also in the train. This is why we insist on the lifelong learning per se. So for me, it's a very important topic. Now, back to the specific point that about the PDBs. First of all, for me, I want to thank and congratulate all the colleagues from the public development banks in this meeting. The simple fact about creating that coalition of finance in common, I believe, is a huge step toward this public-private capital mix that we're talking about. And I've seen that in the past 2-3 years in my formal capacity when I was in IFAD. Secondly, you know, in his introductory remarks, Governor Monticelli came back on the uniqueness of the Council of Europe and Development Bank mandate to essentially focusing on social investment. I think we need more than one bank that is focusing on social investment. And thirdly, for the bank that are in existence, could we ensure that their mandate allows them? Let's face it, until recently, most of the public development bank has been financing infrastructure projects that the risk assessment is easier to do, to analyze the risk itself, and secondly, to be able to take that risk. Whereas the social investment have long been considered as too risky area. So how can we ensure that the development bank are helped in that risk management through a reshaping of the national policy and or some kind of protection that they might also need. We also need to think about shared risk approach, and just like you have seen different attempts during the COVID. So we, in other words, we really need to be creative financing that, and we see in the social protection domain, we see a lot of innovation that is coming there at a small or medium size level. All in all, I'll just end by a point that I made in my first point, that the ongoing discussion about let's don't look at that only from a public development bank perspective, but looking at that from the whole perspective of financing for development. Is that whole architecture that we need to reshape and making sure that all are very well working together. Over.
Thank you very much. I think other distinguished speakers wanted also to react. I see Owen Tudor, who raised his hand, and then afterwards to Marie-Hélène Loison and Governor Monticelli. Go ahead, Owen.
So thanks very much. I wanted to pick up two of the questions that have been raised.
It's not loud enough. Wait a second.
No, it's because I hadn't lowered my rookie error. I hadn't lowered my
It's a matter of long life.
Indeed. So I wanted to pick up two of the points that have been raised. One of them that Gilbert touched on about the impact of machine learning and the fourth industrial revolution. If this is the fourth industrial revolution, and obviously people count them differently, you'd think we'd have worked out how to do it by now. And there are lessons from the earlier industrial revolutions that really the key question about the pace of change and the outcome. I mean, Gilbert identified that you can easily find evidence that machine learning will create more jobs and potentially more skilled, more rewarding jobs, but it really depends how you do it. How you introduce these new technologies, and our experience from previous industrial revolutions is the more you consult with the workforce, the more you engage with the workforce and do social dialogue, the faster you can introduce these new technologies, and with more social justice alongside. So there is a win-win situation there that can be delivered, and I think we should at least shoot for that in terms of machine learning. In terms also of the question that was also raised about the risk aversion of private investors, I mean, partly that's why I was saying it's the role of the PDBs to fill the gaps left by that risk aversion that isn't doing the right thing. But I think we also need to encourage people to assess risk slightly differently. If your assessment of risk isn't taking account of the fact that your investment might increase the chances of climate change, might actually damage the world's environment and the environment that we all live in, then I can't imagine a riskier investment strategy than that. And what we need to do is we need to make sure that when people are discussing risk of investments, that they're actually taking a more realistic assessment of the risks of climate change and the risks of global warming when people assess risks, so that actually the investments in just transition and in lower and no carbon economies, the risk of that is much less than the risk of pulling carbon out of the ground. Thanks.
Thank you, Owen, to draw our attention on risk assessment, as Director General said it also before. I will maybe give the floor first to Marie-Hélène and let you have the last word before I wrap up.
Thank you, Anousheh. Yes, answering the question about how we can increase mobilization of private sector and private money, obviously is very relevant, because I was mentioning, at the beginning, what represents the coalition of public development banks, and these are, huge numbers. But actually they're still insufficient to finance the transition. So obviously our role to mobilize more private money is key, especially because, for example, the commitment that was made during the COP15 to transfer $100 billion for helping developing countries to make the transition. We know we have not achieved this goal. So there are many things that can be said about this, but the one element I wanted to stress is what we are trying to do at AFD to work on transforming financial systems. For example, we are working in India. Well, frankly, we don't have the balance sheet to be at scale in India. So if we just finance projects, it's interesting, but clearly not sufficient. So what we've been doing, for example, in India, is precisely working with the Indian financial system to align it and redirect the flows of the financial system towards SDGs and Paris Agreement. So we have launched last year a coalition in India that's called Greening the Indian Financial System. And so we are promoting this dialogue between financial institutions, public and private, to align strategies, activities with SDGs and direct more flows towards financing the transitions.
Thank you. Governor Monticelli.
First, one reaction to this crucial issue of leveraging the public multilateral development banks action to be a catalyst for the attracting private capital to worthy projects to address the social challenges, and most importantly, the climate challenge. How can this be concretely done? Once again, there is no silver bullet. One has to think exactly about the type of project, and where maybe the key thing is to provide financing directly to the private sector. Other times we have instead the need to be innovative in terms of financial instrument to manage risk. We can be innovative not only on the asset side, but also on the liability side of multilateral development banks. We at SEB have been leading in issuing social bonds. That is yet another way to attract private capital to be functional to the objective of a just transition. There is also an issue of to be creative and innovative in terms of scale of the projects. Clearly, the intervention that can be done, say, by public development banks, by multilateral development banks on large projects as a large transport infrastructure are different from what can be done in catalyzing the involvement in private sector for micro, small and medium enterprises that are equally, it is an equally important area to have a larger investment of private capital. Finally, I would just make a comment on the issue of the impact of artificial intelligence on labor market, and this is just to flag how different this innovation is going to be, because it is affecting all the segments of the labor market. Traditionally, innovation is particularly hitting the lower scaled part. This will not be the case. And indeed, the big risk out there is that these extra jobs created by the increasing role of artificial intelligence are to be on the low scale rather than the high scale of the work, making really this even more challenging. Thank you
very much. It is very important to hear from you about risk sharing management and also risk assessment, as many distinguished speakers underlined. Thank you, first of all, to all our panelists and speakers for a very rich conversation. We were even heard in Russia, we know now, and it is very important for us. It's a matter of pride. I take away from what we said that we are all convinced that green transition can create more skilled and rewarding jobs and better incomes for our people and for our enterprises. There are huge opportunities. You all stressed on that. What we now need to focus on is making the transition just. It is complex. I won't say difficult, but complex. And there is a positive trend we should building on, which is focused on inclusive processes by creating synergies, you said, and by implementing projects that leverage impactful financing with, a whole asset of risk management and risk sharing. How should we prioritize? That could be a question. I think we should have a comprehensive dialogue to set priorities and coordination between stakeholders to walk the talk. Governments, of course, local authorities, social partners, PSOs, PDBs, UN agencies. We must create that synergy, because this is the only way to get through this very gigantic challenge we are facing. This is true for energy transition, but also for the other transitions. And you mentioned artificial intelligence and digital shift, but also demography, as our colleague Jacqueline Mugo said about Africa. Only time and testing solutions will tell how to increase the quality and the volume of social investment globally. Finally, it is important to consider the country's context, you said, and community dialogue, including social dialogue. The leadership of the ILO will definitely help our group playing a useful role. PDBs can set the right instruments. We heard from you, we heard from the floor from our South American colleagues, matching quick wins and long-term policy support, as you said, Mattia. I very much look forward contributing all together to this crucial agenda, but we also have some milestones in our agenda, in particular the Paris Summit for a new financial pact in June this year, and the 2023 Financing Common Summit in Cartagena in September, to which you are all invited. Thank you very much.